The air in the small, overcrowded waiting room of the 73rd Precinct substation felt thick and poisonous, saturated with the odors of cheap, industrial-strength disinfectant, spilled coffee grounds baked into the linoleum, and the metallic tang of fear. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment, meticulously designed to strip anyone who entered of their dignity, a perfect reflection of the bureaucratic apathy and desperate ambition that fueled the lower echelons of the federal anti-narcotics apparatus in the late 1970s. And yet, none of the customary indignities of the station house mattered compared to the chilling, immediate reality unfolding beside a water cooler that hummed with monotonous inefficiency. There, caught between the cinder block wall and a discarded stack of stale arrest reports, stood a girl, no older than 12, her school uniform pristine, her eyes wide and wet, reflecting the harsh glare of a bare fluorescent bulb above, and pointing directly at the center of her small chest, held steady by a hand that trembled only slightly with adrenaline and desperation, was the muzzle of a standard-issue Smith & Wesson Model 10, stainless steel catching the light with a lethal, almost casual indifference. This was not a scene designed for routine interrogation. This was a boundary being crossed, an invisible sacred line that even the most vicious elements of organized crime and the most zealous members of law enforcement tacitly agreed never to breach. The girl was Nicole Lucas, daughter of Frank Lucas, and the man gripping the weapon was DEA Agent Michael Vaughn, a name that, until that moment, had been synonymous only with mid-level incompetence and a consuming, career-ending desire for one impossible victory. The silence that descended upon the station was absolute, a heavy blanket muffling the distant sirens and the clatter of typewriters from the adjacent offices. Everyone present, the two uniformed officers shuffling papers, the grizzled detective chewing on an unlit cigar, even the janitor pushing his mop bucket, knew instantly, instinctively, that they were witnesses to a catastrophic, world-altering mistake. They knew the history of the man whose bloodline was being threatened, the sheer, unimaginable depth of his reach, and the brutal efficiency with which he maintained the sanctity of his private life. Frank Lucas, the undisputed emperor of the heroin trade in Harlem, a figure whose legend had grown far larger than the man himself, a ghost who orchestrated global logistics from the corner of a downtown cafe, was untouchable, not because of bulletproof vests or armed guards, but because of a meticulous, decades-long construction of leverage. Vaughn, however, was deaf to the unspoken warnings echoing through the precinct. He was obsessed, burning with the frustrated ambition of a man who had spent 10 years chasing shadows and watching his colleagues rise on the backs of busts he almost made. Lucas was Vaughn's white whale, the single quarry that would validate a lifetime of thankless stakeout and failed surveillance. Vaughn saw the girl not as a child, but as the ultimate, exquisite pressure point. "Tell him to pick up the phone, little bird," Vaughn hissed, his voice strained, a high-pitched, almost panicked tremor undermining the authority he sought to project. The hand holding the gun was white-knuckled, the index finger hovering nervously around the trigger guard, a millimeter away from crossing the threshold of irreversible action. "Tell Frank Lucas that Agent Vaughn sends his regards, and he has 5 minutes to walk in here without backup, without lawyers, and start talking about the Golden Triangle, or I promise you, this ends differently than either of us wants." Nicole did not cry. She merely stared at the agent, her face a mask of paralyzing terror that was slowly giving way to a flicker of inherited defiance. She had been taught resilience by the circumstances of her birth, learning early that showing vulnerability was a tactical error in their world. The tension was already unbearable, yet it was only the prelude. To understand the gravity of this confrontation, the reason why a single-pointed gun could catalyze the literal, institutional annihilation of an entire precinct, one must first grasp the architecture of Frank Lucas's true power. It wasn't merely the stacks of cash hidden behind false walls, or the purity of the blue magic heroin that made him dangerous. It was the network of corruption he had expertly woven into the very fabric of New York's governing bodies. Lucas understood human nature perfectly. He knew that cash was fleeting, but compromise was eternal. Over the years, He hadn't just paid off beat cops. He had cultivated relationships with judges needing campaign funding, internal affairs investigators looking the other way on promotions, and district attorneys eager for quiet retirement packages. His influence was less a criminal conspiracy and more a parasitic symbiosis, feeding off the institutional weakness of the city. He didn't just bribe, he collected information, the kind of devastating, career-destroying secrets that guaranteed silence and guaranteed immediate, obedient response. This leverage was his shield, and his family was kept religiously outside its radius. Frank Lucas had built his empire on violence, yes, but he had ruled it with an almost medieval sense of territorial integrity, demanding absolute respect for the separation between his professional brutality and his private sanctity. And Agent Michael Vaughn had just shattered that sanctity with a reckless abandon born of desperation. The phone on the wall beside Vaughn, a black rotary relic, suddenly rang, shattering the strained quiet. It was a sharp, demanding sound. Vaughn instinctively flinched, momentarily losing the steel in his "Answer it!" he snarled at a uniformed officer named Jenkins, whose face was pale, betraying the full measure of his panic. Jenkins moved like a marionette, his movements stiff and jerky. Jenkins picked up the receiver, holding it away from his ear as if it might bite him. His eyes darted nervously between Vaughn's gun and Nicole's petrified posture. He spoke a tentative, 73rd Precinct Jenkins into the mouthpiece, and then froze, listening. As he listened, the color drained completely from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed to stammer out a single horrified word. "It's him, Frank Lucas." Vaughn snatched the phone from Jenkins with a violence that made the officer stumble backwards. He held the phone to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs, a surge of triumph fighting with an unnerving, icy premonition. He had him. He had finally brought the Kingpin to the table. "Lucas," Vaughn breathed, trying to sound authoritative, the adrenaline making his voice unsteady. "You see the situation. Your daughter is safe, for now, but you will comply with my instructions exactly, or I swear to God, I will pull this trigger and claim self-defense." No jury in New York would convict a DEA agent protecting himself against a known drug trafficker's family, especially after they interfered with a federal operation. On the other end of the line, the voice of Frank Lucas was not the raging roar Vaughn had expected. It was a quiet voice, deep and resonant, possessing the terrifying calm of a deep-sea trench. It spoke not of negotiation, but of absolute, irreversible decree. "Agent Vaughn," Lucas said, the name delivered with the slow, deliberate weight of judgment. "You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. You have brought the force of the state against my flesh and blood, relying on the flimsy shield of your badge to protect you from natural consequence." Vaughn laughed, a sharp, nervous bark. "Consequence? You're in deep, Lucas. You're going to jail for the rest of your life, and your family is leverage." "Leverage is what I provide to others," Lucas corrected smoothly, his tone utterly devoid of heat, which somehow made it exponentially more menacing. "What you have done is sign a death warrant. Not for yourself, Agent Vaughn. Your life is meaningless to me. What you have signed is a declaration of institutional war." Vaughn gripped the gun tighter, the metallic heat of the handle mingling with the sweat of his palm. "Threatening a federal agent? That's going to buy you another 10 years, Lucas. I am not threatening you, Agent. I am informing you of a certainty. Look around your precinct. Look at the men whose lives you have just imperiled with your desperate, petty ambition. You see the walls around you, the desks, the files, the evidence, the authority you rely upon." Lucas paused, and the silence stretched tight across the telephone wire, vibrating with unseen power. "In the next 72 hours, Lucas continued, the pronouncement cold and final, every single piece of that infrastructure will cease to exist. Every file will vanish. Every officer who witnessed this violation will be unemployed and under federal investigation. That precinct, Agent Vaughn, that building, that bureaucratic entity that grants you authority, I promise you, it will simply disappear. It will become a memory that no one in this city can afford to admit existed." Vaughn felt a sudden, profound chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had always dismissed the rumors of Lucas's untouchability as typical gangster hyperbole. Now, hearing the detached, surgical precision in his voice, Vaughn began to realize that Lucas operated on a scale entirely outside the conventional criminal matrix. "You're bluffing," Vaughn croaked, though the conviction was absent from his voice. He glanced at Nicole, whose wide, innocent eyes were fixed on him, reflecting his growing terror. "Am I?" Lucas countered. "Think about the last 3 major DEA operations against me. They all stalled. They all died on the vine. You think that was coincidence? I own the silence of the city, Agent. And when you threaten my daughter, I don't send muscle. I send auditors. I send subpoenas. I send federal prosecutors with evidence you've been collecting for, unknowingly, for years. I turn the system against itself because I own the hands that hold the levers." Lucas delivered the final, crushing instruction. "You will drop the weapon. You will escort my daughter to the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. You will do this alone, with no surveillance, no backup, and no further interference. If I see one uniform, one wiretap, one shadow, what happens next begins immediately and cannot be stopped. You have 5 minutes to save the careers of every man currently breathing the air in that sad little outpost. Choose wisely, Agent Vaughn, because you have taken a simple crime and turned it into an administrative apocalypse." The phone clicked dead, leaving Vaughn standing in the suffocating silence, the dead weight of the receiver still pressed against his ear. His heart, which moments ago had been thumping with adrenaline, now felt like a block of ice. He looked down at the gun in his hand, no longer seeing a tool of enforcement, but a trigger for institutional collapse. The witnesses in the room, Jenkins, the detective, the janitor, they hadn't heard Lucas's exact words, but they had heard Vaughn's side of the conversation, and they saw the transformation in the agent's eyes. The burning zeal had been replaced by a realization of absolute terrifying defeat. Vaughn slowly, deliberately lowered the weapon. The cold steel dropped away from Nicole's chest. He didn't holler for backup. He didn't call his supervisor. Within 15 minutes, he had escorted Nicole to the designated corner, where a black Lincoln Continental idled at the curb. The girl climbed inside without a word, and the car disappeared into Harlem traffic. Vaughn returned to the precinct alone, his badge suddenly feeling like a noose around his neck. 12 blocks away, in a sparse but immaculate office above a bodega on Malcolm X Boulevard, Frank Lucas hung up the phone with the deliberate care of a surgeon setting down a scalpel. The image of the federal agent pointing a weapon at his daughter's chest was seared into his mind, but his face remained an impassive mask. Lucas was not simply a drug trafficker, he was a logistical architect. He did not traffic merely in heroin, he trafficked in fear, certainty, and leverage. His power was derived from making things happen in ways that defied conventional understanding, using the very structures meant to contain him as tools of his vengeance. The target was not Agent Vaughn personally. Killing one man would be crude, expected, amateur. The target was the system that had allowed Vaughn to feel safe committing that act, the precinct itself. Lucas opened a locked drawer in his desk and removed a thick manila folder. Inside were years of meticulously compiled documentation, financial irregularities in the 73rd Precinct's budget, offshore account numbers linked to senior officers, photographs of evidence room theft, recordings of conversations that should never have been recorded, and personnel files that revealed a pattern of corruption so pervasive it implicated not just individuals but the entire command structure. This was not information gathered for blackmail. This was information gathered as insurance, compiled over a decade through his network of compromised city employees, terrified informants, and willing accomplices embedded within the system itself. Within 2 hours of Nicole's release, Lucas initiated what he privately called the extraction protocol. This was not about guns and violence. This was about paper, permits, audits, and the delicate architecture of municipal liability. His first call went to a mid-level accountant at the city treasury named Marcus Webb, a man who had been quietly supplementing his income through Lucas for 5 years. Webb's instructions were simple: initiate an emergency forensic audit of the 73rd Precinct's budget, focusing on overtime fraud, equipment procurement irregularities, and asset forfeiture discrepancy. The second call went to a building inspector named Robert Henderson, whose gambling debts to Lucas totaled $87,000. Henderson's job was to conduct an unscheduled structural integrity assessment of the precinct building and to document every code violation, deferred maintenance, and safety, of which there were many in the aging facility. The third call went to Eleanor Chen, a clerk in the Internal Affairs Division, who had access to complaint files. Her task was to compile and anonymously forward to the FBI every buried complaint, every dismissed investigation, every instance of excessive force that had been swept under the rug at the 73rd Precinct over the past 8 years. Lucas didn't need to threaten these people. They were already terrified of him, already complicit, and, most importantly, they understood that what he was asking them to do was simply to document the truth. The 73rd Precinct was genuinely corrupt. Lucas was merely forcing the system to acknowledge what it had spent years trying to ignore. The wheels began turning with bureaucratic inevitability. On Monday morning, Marcus Webb's audit request landed on the desk of the City Comptroller's office. By Monday afternoon, preliminary findings revealed over $2 million in unaccounted overtime payments and mysteriously missing evidence room assets. On Tuesday, Henderson filed his structural report, documenting severe foundation deterioration, asbestos in the walls, faulty electrical systems, and a dozen code violations serious enough to warrant immediate evacuation. The report was flagged as urgent and forwarded to the Department of Building. On Wednesday, the FBI received an anonymous package containing 8 years of internal affairs complaints, dozens of them, showing a clear pattern of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and systematic abuse that had been deliberately suppressed by precinct leadership. Each piece alone might have triggered a routine investigation. Together, arriving simultaneously from different departments, they created the appearance of a precinct in complete institutional collapse. But Lucas had one more card to play, the most devastating one. Through his contacts in the U.S. Attorney's Office, cultivated over years through carefully placed information about other criminal organizations, Lucas arranged a meeting. He walked into a federal building in Lower Manhattan on Thursday morning, accompanied by 3 lawyers, and sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney James Keller. "I'm prepared to provide comprehensive testimony," Lucas said calmly, "regarding corruption within the NYPD, DEA, and federal judiciary. I have documentation, recordings, and first-hand knowledge of a criminal conspiracy that spans multiple. In exchange, I want full immunity for my family and protection under the Federal Witness Security Program." Keller, who had been chasing Lucas for 5 years, initially thought it was a trap. But as Lucas began outlining what he knew, which judges were paid off, which DEA agents were on his payroll, which evidence lockers were regularly plundered, Keller realized he was being handed the corruption case of the century. "Why now?" Keller asked suspiciously. "Because," Lucas replied, his voice hard as iron, "a DEA agent named Michael Vaughn pointed a gun at my 12-year-old daughter in the 73rd Precinct. He used his badge to threaten my family. I will destroy everyone who made that possible, and I will do it legally." The deal was struck within 48 hours. The federal raid on the 73rd Precinct came at dawn on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Vaughn had pointed his gun at Nicole Lucas. It was not a typical raid. This was an administrative occupation. Unmarked black sedans filled the streets. Federal marshals, IRS criminal investigation agents, and FBI corruption task force members entered the building with boxes, cameras, and sealed federal warrants. Captain Riley, the precinct commander, who had been accepting $30,000 monthly to ignore Lucas's distribution routes, was arrested in his office. He was handcuffed, and Perp walked out the front door as news cameras captured every moment. Agent Vaughn was found in the break room, staring at a cold cup of coffee. When the marshals read him his rights, not for drug enforcement violations, but for corruption, obstruction of justice, and misuse of federal authority, his face showed no surprise. He had known, from the moment Lucas hung up that phone, that this was inevitable. Over the next 72 hours, 53 officers and agents attached to the 73rd Precinct were either arrested, suspended, or placed under investigative review. The evidence Lucas provided was irrefutable: financial records, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and his own meticulously kept ledgers documenting every bribe, every payoff, every compromised official. The federal investigation revealed that the 73rd Precinct had essentially been operating as a criminal enterprise, with systematic corruption reaching from patrol officers to the precinct commander. Evidence rooms had been looted, arrest reports falsified, and civil rights violated with impunity, all while senior leadership looked the other way or actively participated. The Department of Buildings, citing Henderson's structural report and the ongoing federal investigation, declared the building unsafe for occupancy. Within 2 weeks, the 73rd Precinct was permanently shuttered. Its personnel were scattered to other precincts or terminated. Its files were seized as federal evidence. Its very designation was erased from NYPD operational maps. The precinct had, quite literally, disappeared. Frank Lucas served 5 years of a reduced sentence as part of his cooperation agreement. During that time, he testified in over 30 corruption trials. His testimony led to the conviction or forced resignation of 2 judges, 1 district attorney, 17 NYPD officers, and 8 DEA agents, including Michael Vaughn, who received an 18-year federal sentence. But Lucas's real victory was not the reduced sentence. It was the message sent throughout the law enforcement and criminal underworld. Frank Lucas had made an entire police precinct disappear through nothing more than documentation and the strategic deployment of truth. Officer Jenkins, who had answered the phone that day, transferred to a desk job in Queens and took early retirement 2 years later. He never spoke publicly about what he witnessed. Marcus Webb, the accountant, continued his work at the city treasury, his debts to Lucas quietly forgiven as payment for services rendered. Robert Henderson, the building inspector, found that his own mortgage was mysteriously paid off shortly after filing his report. He asked no question. Eleanor Chen received a promotion within internal affairs, though she never discovered who had anonymously advocated for her advancement. Agent Michael Vaughn spent his sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, surrounded by the very criminals he had once pursued. The irony was not lost on anyone. He had pointed a gun at a child and expected surrender. What he received was total institutional annihilation, executed not with violence, but with the methodical exposure of a system that had protected him precisely because it was itself corrupt. Years later, during a prison interview, Vaughn was asked if he regretted his actions that day in the precinct. "I thought I was untouchable," he said quietly. "I thought the badge protected me. I didn't understand that Lucas wasn't threatening me with violence. He was threatening me with truth. And the truth was more devastating than any bullet could have been." The story of the 73rd Precinct's disappearance became an unspoken legend within law enforcement circles. It was whispered about in academy training rooms, discussed in hushed tones in federal buildings, and used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional corruption. The message was clear: do not touch the family of a man who has documented your sins. Do not rely on a badge to protect you from consequence when you cross lines that should never be crossed. And understand that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not a gun, but a filing cabinet full of evidence, and the willingness to burn down the entire system to protect what you love. Frank Lucas had proven he didn't need to draw blood to win. He needed only to reveal the truth. He demonstrated that the pen, backed by irrefutable documentation of systemic failure, was infinitely more lethal than any weapon. In the silent, empty shell of what was once the 73rd Precinct, now a vacant lot awaiting redevelopment, the only lingering truth was that Frank Lucas had delivered precisely what he promised. When they threatened his daughter, he didn't send killers. He sent auditors, prosecutors, and the full weight of a compromised system's own guilt. The precinct had disappeared, erased not by explosives but by exposure, destroyed not by violence, but by the methodical documentation of its own corruption. And in doing so, Frank Lucas had secured something far more valuable than freedom or wealth. He had secured the safety of his family by proving that he possessed the most dangerous weapon of all, the truth about the system itself.